Hey guys, today I have my sand bucket and shovel for building sandcastles at the beach. Have you ever worked really hard, a really long time, adding lots of extra effort on a special sandcastle, only to have it get knocked right over by the waves, or maybe by somebody else? In today's part of the story of Jacob, we're going to see how Jacob worked really hard, so long and so diligently to get what he thought was his perfect ending, only to have it all work out where he had to work over again to get what he really wanted. It's kind of a frustrating story, and it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense in our world today, but let's just jump right in together. Today's part of the story comes from Genesis 29, 30, and 31. You can check it out there with your family in your Bible. So remember, Jacob had to flee because his brother was so mad at him. Then he had this great dream where God promised to take care of him. Well, that brings us to today. Jacob continued on his journey and came to a new area. There was a well, and several shepherds had gathered around waiting to water their flocks. Jacob said to them, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Haran." Jacob asked, "Do you know Laban?" "Yes," they answered. "Is he well?" "Yes," they said. "And here comes his daughter Rachel now with the sheep." Jacob said, "Why aren't you watering the sheep yet?" And they said, "We're waiting for everyone to arrive. Then we'll move the stone from the mouth of the well and water them." When Jacob saw Rachel and her father's sheep, he went over, rolled the stone away, and watered those sheep. Then he told Rachel he was her relative, so she ran back home and told her father. When Laban heard that his nephew was there, he hurried to meet him and hugged him and welcomed him. After a month, Jacob said, "Just because you are my relative, you don't need to work for me for nothing. What would be fair to pay you?" Well, Laban had 2 daughters. Leah was the oldest and had weak eyes, and Rachel was the youngest and was very beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel. He said, "I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your daughter Rachel." Laban agreed. So Jacob worked for 7 years to get Rachel, but those years seemed only like a few days to him because he loved her so. After 7 years, Jacob went to Laban and said, "I've worked my time and I want to take Rachel as my wife." So Laban threw a feast, and that night brought his oldest daughter, Leah, and gave her to Jacob to be his wife. The next morning, Jacob realized what had happened and that he had been married to Leah instead of Rachel. He went to Laban and said, "How could you have done this?" Laban said, "It is not customary for our younger daughter to marry before the older. I will give you Rachel too, in return for another 7 years of work." So Jacob agreed and took Rachel as his wife also and worked another 7 years for Laban. Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. Leah began to have children, first Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi and Judah. And Leah hoped that because she had 4 sons, Jacob would love her more, but he didn't. But Rachel was not able to have any children, and she became jealous of her sister. So she gave her servant Bilhah to her husband, and they had a son Dan, and another son, Naphtali. Then Leah realized that she wasn't having any more children, so she gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob, and they had a son, Gad, and later a second son, Asher. Then Leah had another son, Issachar, and another, Zebulun. And later Leah thought, "Surely Jacob will love me the most now." Then she had a daughter named Dinah. And after all of that, Rachel finally had a child, her first, and she named him Joseph. Once they had all of those children, Jacob said to Laban, "I'm going to take all my wives and children and servants and go back to my father's land in Canaan." And Laban said, "No, I need to pay you for all that you've done. How could I pay you?" Jacob said, "Do this one thing. Give me all of your speckled or spotted sheep, the dark-colored lambs and goats, and that will be my wages. And if there's ever a goat in my possession that isn't speckled in the future, we'll know that it's not mine." And Laban agreed. So they took all of the speckled goats and sheep and went a 3 days' journey away. But Jacob was smart, and so he devised a plan. When it was time for the sheep to mate, he had all of Laban's sheep mate with his spotted sheep. So all of the young sheep had spots or speckles, and they grew more and more, stronger and stronger, while Laban's sheep grew weaker and fewer. Laban's sons began to grumble about Jacob taking all that was supposed to be theirs, and Laban's attitude toward him changed too. God told Jacob to go back to the land that his father had come from and that God would be with him. So Jacob took Rachel and Leah and all of their children and livestock and goods and traveled to go back to the land of his father Canaan. But just before they left, Rachel snuck into her father's room and stole his gods. 3 days later, Laban realized that they had fled, and so he set out with all of his people to hunt them down. And on the 7th day, he caught up with Jacob. But God told him in a dream, "Do not say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." The next day, Laban said, "What have you done? Why did you run off and not even say goodbye? You have done a foolish thing, and I could have harmed you last night, but God told me not to. Why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered and said, "I was afraid that you would take your daughters away from me, but we didn't steal anything. If you find anyone here who has stolen your gods, then that person shall not live." Jacob didn't know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went and he looked in all the tents. Rachel had taken the gods and put them in her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. So when Laban looked, he couldn't find the stolen gods. Jacob was angry and said, "Why have you hunted me down and called me a thief? I've been with you for 22 years and I have never stolen from you. You have changed our agreements time and time again, made me work for 14 years for your daughters and changed my wages 10 times over. But God has seen my hardship and my work." Laban said, "Let's make a covenant between us." So they took stones and they piled them up between them in a heap. "This heap between us, let it be a witness. May God keep us both while we are apart. We won't harm one another, and God will be our witness." The next day, Laban said goodbye and returned back home. Whew. I told you this was going to be one wild and crazy story. Did you know all of that was in the Bible? Well, this story was full of problems. People were having all kinds of problems with one another. More lying, more stealing, more cheating, more jealousy, more breaking of promises, more selfishness, more struggles, and more disappointment. That is not a picture of how we should act, or a model for how we are to live. But in the end, they made a covenant, an agreement to get along with one another, and they asked God to guide them. What kind of problems are you facing? What challenges is your family dealing with right now? Could you make a heap out of all those challenges, like a giant heap of sand, and commit to let God guide you through them all? Why don't you write down any challenges you're facing? Write them down, no matter how big they are or how small they are. Every person in your family. It might be sibling arguments or challenges dealing with work and the way that school's going to happen, or money, or difficult neighbors, or whining, or loneliness, or sickness, or anything. Whatever challenges you're facing, write them all down and place all those challenges in one big heap. And then pray together. Join hands around your heap of problems and commit to stick together and to get along as you let God guide you through. If God can help this mess of a family, I am sure God can help you too. We can trust God to get us through life's challenges and problems, however big or small. I hope you have a great week. And if you get a chance to build a sandcastle this week, I'd love to see a picture of it. And I'll see you next week with another super summer fun item and more of the story of Jacob.